What's going on, guys? Today we're going to talk about overwedging and some ways to fix it, why it happens, some programming things that you can implement to help, strengthen this issue, and then some considerations for some lifters with short arms who might just end up overwedging anyways. So first, what is it? So what I tend to see is people will just set up on the bar, or they'll not have a setup. They'll reach down to grab the bar, and they'll try to get their hips really low, and they'll try to squat the weight up like so. Now, reason why this is not going to be optimal is because once you get to a heavy enough load, what's going to happen is the bar wants to be underneath basically your scapula or your shoulder blade when it leaves the floor. And if we are trying to set up in this super unrealistic position, the bar is going to be out in front of us. What's going to happen is when the weight gets heavy enough, our hips are going to shoot up, our chest is going to dump forward, and we're going to be in like a super high hip position, to which we are not going to be very efficient and strong in because we haven't generated adequate tension from that position to start with the setup. So the first thing we're going to do is actually go over, how to set up for both conventional and sumo. So I'm going to show you that now from the side so you can kind of get an idea of what I look for and what I would like to cue. So conventional setup. What we're going to look at here is setting up with the bar over our midfoot, which for most people is going to end up being slightly right about here, not so high up that it's, basically touching your ankle or over like the front of your laces, but a couple inches down is truly where your midfoot is. So you're going to set up with the bar over your midfoot. From here, what you're going to do is you're going to take your two fingers, you're going to put your thumbs kind of like on your obliques, you're going to put your pointer fingers on your top of your thighs or top of your quads, and you are going to close your fingers in order to help you cue that hinge. And we want our shins to be somewhat straight up and down when we do this. You can see here, I hinge over, and my shins are relatively vertical or straight up and down as much as I can be in these squishy shoes. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach to the bar. I'm going to secure my grip. I'm going to let my shins come forward so they lightly touch the barbell without letting it roll forward. They're going to lightly touch the barbell. And from here, I'm going to pull my head up slightly extend my upper back a little bit. I'm going to drop my shoulders, or think about slightly pulling them down more towards my my hips to generate some adequate lat tension. And from here, I'm going to simply stand up. Now, there's a lot going on there, so I'd like to give some cues to kind of help speed that up. So, and some things to consider when we're adequately trying to tension the bar. So, when we are actually down at the bar, there's a couple things I like to think about. Number one, what we're trying to do is generate a lot of leg drive off the floor. So I like to think about leg pressing the floor away from me. The next thing we want to do is make sure that our arms are staying long and that we are not over cueing, pulling our chest up, over cueing, lat tension. We just want enough to keep the bar close to us when we're pulling in a sort of, straight arm lat pull down movement, right? So there's two cues here. What I like to think about is trying to keep our upper body as far away from the bar as possible, which is going to cue a lot of scapular depression. And then making sure that we are doing that straight arm lat pull down. That's going to keep the bar close to us as we pull. Last thing you want to focus on from here is simply just thinking as the bar is coming off the floor and we are beginning to try to lock out, we're trying to think of meeting the bar with our hips, or in a more crude cue would be just trying to hump the bar, right? So those are some cues that I like to think about, some ways to think about tensioning when we are setting up so that we're getting tight in all the right places and we aren't just haphazardly reaching down to grab the bar and, kind of setting ourselves up for failure. So now I'm going to go over sumo and what I like to see from sumo, which is slightly different, just one little added difference, but most of the cues and most of the setup is going to be the same. Okay, so for sumo, there is the additional consideration now that we are now much more externally rotated. We have a wider stance, and we are now abducting or letting our thighs come out as well. So from here, we're going to go in a little bit of a reverse order where we are going to let our knees and our hips open up and abduct and externally rotate first. From here, everything else is going to remain the same. We're going to let ourselves hinge, going through that same process of pushing our hips back, closing our fingers, right? From here, we're going to reach down, grab the bar, let our shins slightly come forward to just touch the bar, pull our head up like we talked about, let those shoulders drop, slightly more towards our waist, and then we're going to leg press the floor away and stand up, just like so. So everything basically remains the same. And then one additional cue that I put in there, because we are now going to be more externally rotated and abducting our hips, one that works for me, one that works for some of my lifters, is physically just thinking about spreading the floor this way. So we aren't just thinking about pushing down. There is now an additional force vector that we have to worry about, which is kind of like pushing this way, right? So those are two setups that we can use if you pull sumo or conventional. And now I'm just going to go over some little minor nuances on some programming consideration in terms of like what movements we want to add in here besides, the setup that we just went over. Some reasons why this can happen for lifters. And then we're going to talk about the subset of lifters to which is going to be unavoidable and how they can kind of manage this issue. Okay, so first we can go over why this happens. Now, the first reason why is just improper setup, which we just kind of went over. Once you have a good setup and once you start, realizing what you're trying to accomplish with the setup in terms of tensioning, in terms of cueing, a lot of the overwedging will kind of go away. But other reasons as to why it can happen is, number one, a lot of people may just simply have weak posterior chains. And so they're self-organizing into a position that's going to allow them to be the most comfortable and which position feels the strongest for them, right? Because if someone has weak hamstrings, weak glutes, weak lower back, they're not going to be incredibly comfortable setting up that way, right? So what we need to do for these lifters is start physically getting those structures stronger, right? So starting as simple as doing things like more leg curls, doing like kettlebell swings, doing glute hip thrusts, doing just minor back extensions are going to be great ways to start. From there, you can start progressing into more complex skill-based movements, things that are going to have more carryover, like RDLs, stiff leg deadlifts, glute ham raises are going to be great options to kind of start building a stronger lifter in those positions. So lastly, what we are going to talk about is actually the lifters in which this is going to be unavoidable. And there's a category of lifters for this. And I see it with people that have exceedingly short arms. And the reason why this will happen is because for them, and they also tend to have very long torsos, right? So with this type of lifter, they're going to have a very hard time pulling with that like slightly higher hip position that I'm talking about compared to their like overwedging normal style. So for these lifters, what you want to consider is that, number one, they're going to end up in that position anyway. So we want to find ways for them to be strong in that kind of like overwedged position and to be strong in that high hip position when they go to pull maximal weights. So I already kind of went over ways to strengthen our posterior chain, right? We want to have those movements in the program for that lifter. Now, some other things to consider then is they're likely going to need very strong quads when they pull, simply because they're going to be most of the time dropping their hips very low. The second thing we want to consider is that we need, a very strong brace, because once we start to go very, very heavy, they're going to have that high hip position, and the bar is going to be doing everything in its power to try to throw them out of position. So having a very strong brace in terms of obliques, in terms of abs, in terms of lower back as well, and their lats, that's going to be huge for making sure that they can stay very strong through their torso and through their trunk. Lastly, an actual programming thing I would advise is for those lifters, they don't go incredibly heavy as often, and they spend more time in like sub-maximal RPE ranges. So a typical block setup for a lifter might be, for their deadlift, we'll say triples, right? It might be something like RPE 5, RPE 6, RPE 7, and ending with an RPE 8 set, right? For someone who has this type of issue, that is like a shorter arm lifter, what we might do is start with RPE 4, RPE 5, RPE 6 or 6.5, and then RPE 8. So these first 3 weeks are a lot less, in terms of absolute intensity and in terms of relative intensity, but that we still get that top end exposure on the very last day of the block for their primary deadlift. so that way they can still progress without beating up their back too much. Because what will end up happening is those lifters tend to have very strong squats anyway. So that squat will help build their deadlift, and then we just have that top end exposure for skill practice, and we're not getting so beat up throughout the mesocycle to where that top end isn't just going to show up because we're so fatigued or so beat up. So those are some ways to combat overwedging. I hope you guys liked the video. This is definitely a longer video. Let me know if you guys have any comments or questions or anything like that, and any suggestions on anything you'd like to see next. But thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the video.